If you're wondering what the performance difference is between the LCD and OLED Steam Deck as well as the Ally, then this is the video for you. Maybe you even have an LCD Steam Deck and are wondering if you should get the OLED or the Ally, or you might have an Ally and want to see how the OLED performance is to see if it's something you might want to pick up. We're going to be testing 12 watts at 720p on all devices, as well as 15 watts at 720p and 1080p. And we're also going to be testing 30 watts on the Ally at 720p and 1080p to see how they perform when they're all at maximum power. As always, there's timestamps below, so you can jump to the section that interests you the most. First, I'm going to be showing you all the settings used in game. You can ignore the resolution. We're doing 720p, 1080p, which will also be labeled, but we'll have a quick section at the beginning of each game just showing the settings, so you can even test this on your device if you'd like. And then after we get through the settings, you'll see the LCD will always be over here on the left. The OLED is always going to be in the middle, and the Ally will always be on the right. And here at 720p at 12 watts, you can see down here it's green. As we go to 15 watts, you'll notice we have another benchmark here, and the reason for this is 30 watts on the Ally, so max performance on the Ally you can see at 720p, so we can still see the 15 watts 720p right here on all of them, just across the top right here. Then we can come down here and check out the Ally FPS at that 30 watts. And it's going to be the same thing for 1080p, except we have the text in yellow now just to show it's at that 1080p resolution. And starting off with Crysis, we're using SMAA, and we're just using the default medium preset. And here at 12 watts 720p, you can see we're getting about 2 to 3 more FPS on the OLED at around 80-ish, and it is absolutely smoking the Ally at this 12 watts. What's interesting is these games will flip-flop over and over again depending on the resolution, the watt settings, and the game itself. So these results are going to be all over the board depending on those. Bumping all three of them up to 15 watts, and now it's really close, but the OLED is still winning along with the LCD. You can see here, if we just freeze it, 86 FPS, 91, and we're getting about 87, so it's close. But take a look down here. This is where we have 30 watts running. We're getting about 109. Now here's something that's really weird. When he looks down, whatever this is, let me fast forward just a little bit so I can show you. So right here, for whatever reason, after the helmet goes on, you can see the FPS is dipping a bit on both these Steam Decks. We're at about 80 and we're at 120 now as we're about to jump out of this plane, and then 99. So the results are just all over the place. They're more consistent on the Ally than the Steam Deck. It could be something to do with SteamOS. Here we are at 43 to 47 or so. So we're getting about 2-3 FPS over here, about 5 or 6% I would say on the OLED, a performance gain. And here at 1080p, the Ally is ahead even in this scene right here, just by a little bit, so around 50. And then bumping it up to 30 watts really doesn't make much of a difference. We're only going to about 55, so it's only about a 7 FPS gain or so. Jumping into Cyberpunk, we're at the medium preset. We have FSR set to auto here, and which automatically enables with that medium preset. And starting off at 12 watts, we're close to 40 FPS on the Steam Decks. You can see about 36, 34, so we're getting about 2-3 more FPS on that OLED, so a little bit more performance. And if you look at these temperatures up here, you will always see the OLED is almost 10 degrees Celsius cooler, and the fans are a little bit quieter. So at 12 watts, 720p, it's amazing to be hitting around the 40s. You saw 50 there. Let's just fast forward a little as we go outside, and right here in one of the more intense scenes, still holding around the 30, mid-30s. Whereas over here, we're at about 28. Here at 15 watts, and it's almost the same on the Steam Decks for some reason. They're still right around 40, a little bit more. And then the Ally is at about 48. So very close between the OLED and Ally at 15 watts at 720p. Then down here though, once we bump it to 30, you can see about 70, another 20 or so additional FPS compared to the Steam Decks. Then here we are at 15 watts, 1080p, and this would definitely be somewhat unplayable at 15 watts on all of them. The Ally is very close to 30, kind of maintaining it. You can see these Steam Decks are dipping down below 30. But if we bump it to 30 watts, you can see here we're getting in the mid 40s going all the way up to 50. So very playable. Here's one of the more intense scenes, and we're still at about 40 FPS. So you can see where the extra watts really help out here. Now we have Doom. This is 2016, not the Eternal Edition. And you can see we're running SMAA. And for the settings, we're just running the overall quality at medium. And here we can see about 60 FPS on the Steam Deck at a 12 watt TDP limit at 720p. And right here, it went a little above. And then on the Ally, we're sitting at about 70 or so. So it is roughly, I would say, about 17 more FPS. This is just where things get a bit strange, that we're seeing such a difference in the performance on the Ally compared to the Steam Decks. Bumping this to 15 watts, and we're not seeing much change on the Steam Decks, maybe a little bit in FPS, about 60. But we are seeing a huge bump in the Ally, getting almost 100 at that 15 watt range, and then 120 plus at the 30 watts. So you'd actually be going out of the Ally's VRR range. Then here at 1080p, still maintaining around 40, mid 40s on both the Steam Decks, and about 60 at 15 watts on the Ally. And we're getting about 100 FPS if we bump it up to the max watts of 30 on the Ally. All right, now we have Dying Light. This is a pretty fun game. We are just running the balanced preset here. And for this, we're just running through the city, and you can see the LCD and OLEDs are extremely close here, with the OLED pulling in usually only 1 FPS or so additional. And that's around 60 FPS versus about 50 on the Ally at this 12 watt 720p resolution. Then as we push everything up to 15 watts, once again, we're seeing very little gain in FPS on the Steam Decks. And that's because 12 watts is already near that max. Just like on the Ally, if you're at 25, you went to 30, you're not going to see a huge difference, but we are getting about 60 on both, mid 60s on the OLED. And then on the Ally, we're getting about 70. I would say it's about a 7 or 8 FPS gain at 15 watts, going to 30 watts though, and we're seeing about 80 plus. It's pretty much maintaining a little bit above 80 FPS. Then at 15 watts 1080p, you can see here we're in the mid 30s on the Steam Decks, and the Ally is sitting at about 40, or about 4 or 5 additional FPS on the Ally. Then down here at 30 watts, we are seeing a nice bump. So we just freeze here. We can see about 34 on the Steam Decks, 39 on the Ally at the same watts, and then bumping it up, we're getting about 48. Now on to Forza Horizon 5, we're running MSAA 2X, which is what it defaults to, and we're running the medium preset here. Now there's something really weird with this game. I don't know what was causing it, because I don't see this when I'm actually playing. And it might have been when it was loading off of the drive. It just didn't like running it off of the hard drive. But we're getting this stuttering. So I'll fast forward a little bit, and you can see right here, we're getting this stuttering every so often, and it's on both the LCD and the OLED. However, the actual FPS is about what I get when I'm running these settings in game. So if we just ignore that stuttering, it's not a huge deal. I have not been seeing that when actually playing. And we can see here, we're at about 60 FPS at 12 watt 720p on the Steam Decks, with about 3 more on the OLED. And then that's about the same as the Ally. They're very close, about 59 going to 60. They're dipping down around the same area and pretty close. If anything, I would say the OLED is slightly ahead. Here at 15 watts, so bumping it up 3 additional watts, and we can see this right here in this area, which is a little more intense, is around the low 50s, 50-ish on the Steam Decks, and then about 60 on the Ally at 15 watts. We'll just fast forward a little bit. We're getting about 90 at 30 watts on the Ally. Then here at 1080p, 15 watts, let's just fast forward and get to an area that is a little bit less demanding, like right here. And if we freeze it, go back a little, we can see about 46, 48, 52. So very close between those again. And then about 69 over here at 30 watts. Next up, we have GTA 5, and we are running high settings. You can pause here if you'd like to see the settings. In here, I'm running around in the actual game. The benchmark seems to score a bit higher than normal just because of the scenes it runs. So this is actually in the game running around, and you can see we're at about 63 on the LCD, and we're getting a nice bump here around 67, 68 on the OLED, and then pretty much identical performance on the Ally. If anything, the OLED is about 2 or 3 FPS higher, and this is at 12 watts, 720p. Then bumping it up to 15 watts, and we actually do get a little bit of a bump in FPS. You can see here almost 70 on the LCD, about 72 on the OLED for a second there. On the Ally, we're up around the 80s, so about 10 more FPS at 15 watts, 720p. And then bumping that to 30, we're about 6 FPS more than 15 watts at 720p. overall, very high on all of them, and definitely a playable experience. Then here, going to 1080p, and we're still maintaining the mid 40s, around 50 on the Steam Decks. We're getting about mid 50s on the Ally, and then really not getting a whole lot of gain going to 30 watts, honestly. This would definitely be something where I'd be running more the 15 watt range. It doesn't seem to benefit much, only getting about 67, 68 or so. And just depends on the area. So you can see here, 50s, about 60, then about 70. Next up, we have Red Dead Redemption, and it's just one click into favorite quality. And the reason I do this is it makes it where the textures can be seen clearly. They get blurry for some weird reason, like the cash register and stuff, when that is not set that way. I don't know what it is. It's something with a texture glitch, because sometimes it will show the textures, other times it won't. So that's the setting I found to work best. And this one definitely surprised me. As you can see, we're running out of here, getting around 40. I'm just going to freeze it for a second. So we're at 41, 42, but only 34 on the Ally at this 12 watt 720p resolution. So that is really impressive on these Steam Decks. And you can see here at the end, we ended up getting about 44 on both of these Steam Decks and only about 35, 34 on the Ally. Bumping the watts up to 15, and it's definitely closer now. The Ally is right there neck and neck with the OLED. However, when we take it to 30 watts, you can see we're at about 60 FPS, which is pretty good. But overall, this is definitely a playable experience on all of the devices. Then we'll just fast forward here a little bit and get to the end of this benchmark. And we can see we got about 45 on the LCD, and we did get a nice bump going up to higher wattage, getting about 47 on the OLED. And then we're at about 48 on the Ally at 15 watts. And then 61 FPS, bumping that to 30 watts. Now here at 1080p, and we are getting around 30 FPS on the Steam Decks and the Ally at 15 watts, bumping it up to 30, and we're seeing closer to 40 FPS. And here at the end of the benchmark, we're getting about 29, 30 FPS on the LCD, an additional 1 FPS or so on the OLED, and then one more additional FPS on the Ally over the OLED at that 15 watts. But then as we bump it to 30 watts, we're getting around, and then at 30 watts, we're at about 39 FPS, which might not seem like much, but at this lower FPS, that is a pretty big increase. Then here on Insurgency, we're running the medium preset, and the reason I still scroll through all of these are so y'all can see the settings, but I also don't trust presets in some games, so I just like to verify to make sure that nothing is on that shouldn't be on and they all match. And this is one of the most surprising results ever. When I loaded this game up on the LCD, this is a game I actually like playing. I could not believe the performance I was getting and the battery life I was getting. I was locking it down to 45. It was working flawlessly. Then I uncapped it and was seeing about 70-ish or so when I was playing. And you can see here, if we just freeze it for a second, about 72, 74. But look at this, only 55 on the Ally. So I don't know why some games are working so well on these Steam Decks versus the Ally, and then that just flip-flops in other games like we saw in Doom, bumping it up to 15 watts, and we just saw 80 FPS on that OLED, but they're maintaining above 70. Then on the Ally, we're at about 60, mid-60s. Now when we go to 30 watts, we are hitting about 90 FPS, but still 30 watts compared to 15, which is double the power, and the frame rate is within about 10 FPS or so. Then here at 1080p, this is a common trend that I was seeing when I was benchmarking this, and at 15 watts, you can see now the Ally is slightly ahead at that wattage. So if you're planning on docking the system, I think this is where the Ally does have an edge over the Steam Deck, because you're really going to want to run 1080p. You're not going to really enjoy 720p or 800p on an external display. You'd want to do more than 900 to 1080p resolution. In here, we can see it's still really close, just a little ahead at 15, but then at 30 watts, we're getting right here, look at this, 65. So it's an additional 20 FPS and over 15 FPS going from 15 to 30 watts here. Next up, we have Ark, and I am just running the medium preset. However, the resolution scale I'm moving all the way over because it just looks a little too blurry when this isn't at 100%. I would rather just drop the resolution, as I thought that looked better. And this is an extremely hard game to benchmark in motion because of stuttering, as well as the time of day saving. So when you run and exit out, your guy does not go back to the original spot spot, so you have to run back, and then as the time of day changes or creatures attack you or whatever else, it does not stay consistent. So here we're just standing still, and we're getting about 30 FPS across the board, a little bit less on the Ally, so about 28. Then bumping it up to 15 watts, and the Ally's FPS really increased, going from about 28 to 41, and the OLEDs also increased about 31, 32, 33, and then bumping it from 15 watts to 30 watts on the Ally, we're at about 50, so close to a 20 FPS increase if we're comparing 15 watts on the OLED to 30 watts on the Ally at 720p. Going up to 1080p, this is definitely not playable on the Steam Decks at all. We're at about 19 on both of those, and the frame time graph is actually so high, it's just a solid line now, but there's definitely some fluctuations up there, we just can't see it. On the Ally, also unplayable, I would say, at 15 watts. You can see we're at 25 FPS. However, at 30 watts, it's getting us around 31 FPS, so it could be playable. I still think this would be something to drop down to around 900p, and then that should be a decent experience. And it looks pretty good as well, which is something I like about not having the resolution scaling. If you do turn that down, it will get a lot blurrier, but you will get a higher FPS. Moving on to Monster Hunter World. This is Iceborne expansion, and we're running high settings. In here at 720p, 12 watts, we are at about 47 FPS or so on the Steam Decks, and then only 37 on the Ally. So about 10 FPS additional if you're playing on a Steam Deck at this lower wattage. And this is a really fun game that I have been playing on the OLED. I do a 45 FPS cap, and it seems to maintain that most of the time, but does dip down sometimes. Then here we are at 15 watts, and you can see here we're at about 50 FPS on the Steam Decks, about 57 on the Ally at the 15 watts. But then you see here, when we bump it up to 30, we're getting about 70 to 75, depending on where we're at. Granted, this is way more wattage that we're pushing into that system, doing 30 watts over 15. And this is where things are somewhat strange, because even at 1080p 15 watts, we're seeing about the same performance on the Ally and the Steam Decks. And that's where the results are just strange. It really just depends on the games of what the resolution increase is going to do, as well as the wattage between the two systems. And if we freeze right here, we're getting about mid 30s on the Steam Decks, about 32 on the Ally at 15 watts, and then 43 or so at 30 watts on the Ally. Jumping over to Metro Exodus, and we're running medium settings. And I could not get HDR to turn off on the whole system. I turned it off for whatever reason on the OLED. Even right now, it doesn't turn off. Even after reformatting it, it's doing the same thing. I don't know if it's an incompatibility issue with the dock or something else, but HDR is actually not on the right. It's not on in the game, and it's not on in the main settings, but it's showing on here. So I don't know what's going on. So the picture is going to look a little weird on this, but it doesn't seem to be affecting performance at all. We can see here we're at about 60, mid 60 FPS or so. So we'll just freeze right here, like 62, 63, and then only 49 on the Ally. So that is quite a increase on the Steam Decks at this lower watt range. Here, bumping it to 15 watts and very close across the board, about 3 more FPS on the Steam Decks. And then if we go to 30 watts, that is where we are seeing a bit of a difference, getting about 77 or 10 to 11 more FPS going to 30 watts on the Ally. And this is another strange result as we increase the resolution, still at this 15 watt range. We can see the Ally is actually slightly ahead now, only by about 2 or 3 FPS. And then at 30 watts, we're up around 60. So that is a very playable and enjoyable experience at 30 watts. Next, we have BeamNG. This game is pretty intense as far as the resources it uses. Even on my main rig, I cannot run high settings on this. So we're running just a normal preset here. And here at 720p, 12 watts, we'll just fast forward a little bit, get through the benchmark a little ways. And you can see we're at about 40 FPS, and we're getting about 3-4 additional FPS on the OLED. And the Ally is sitting at around 37. And another little area right here, when we go in the tunnel, it's a little less intense. So I'm just going to freeze it right here. And we're at 66, 68, and 56. Then here we are at 15 watts, and we are getting about 4 more FPS. And with it being this low, that's a decent increase on the OLED, and our temps are looking really great. On the Ally, it's almost identical at 15 watts at 720p, getting about 47, 48 FPS. bumping it to 30 watts on the Ally, and we're up around 56. Let's go back a little bit to right here. So we're at about 47, so 54. So about 7 additional FPS or so. And then 1080p at 15 watts, we're at about 30 FPS across the board, a little bit more. If we freeze right here, you can see 30, 33, 34, and then we are getting 42 at 30 watts. So giving it that extra power, which is quite a bit, does increase it into the 40s, which is definitely a more enjoyable experience, and that is at 1080p. Then moving on to a new game I got, Resident Evil 4, and we're using the balanced preset here. We have VSync turned off, and we are not using FSR. I really do not like the way FSR works in this game. It just makes it look blurry, in my opinion. And starting off here at 12 watts, and we're maintaining above 30 on both of these Steam Decks. And we're only getting about 20, back right here, about 27, 25 FPS. Even crossing the bridge right here, you can see it's almost a 10 FPS gap between the Ally and the OLED. Bumping it up to 15 watts though, and neck and neck really on the OLED and Ally. The Ally is just a little bit ahead. And the temperatures, you can see here, 81 Celsius on the LCD and about 70 on the OLED. And then as we're crossing this bridge, if we just freeze it here, we're getting another around 10 to 12 FPS going to 30 watts. So we are sitting at 51 FPS. Definitely a playable experience, and I actually preferred 720p on this game when I was playing it on the Ally. And the main reason I preferred 720p is this result right here. So you can see we're down in the low 20s on both the Steam Decks, and even the Ally is barely able to hit 30 right here where the frame rate's higher, then dips back down into the 20s. Even at 30 watts, it is barely able to maintain above 30 FPS. So it is doing better and it is playable, but I definitely prefer to try to hit the 40s or so. But this just gives you an idea of the performance differences. Next, we have The Witcher 3, and this is just on the medium preset, which automatically turns on FSR set to auto. And here's the rest of the settings if you're interested in those. And this is another one where I could not get HDR to turn off. It's not on in game. It's not on any settings. It refuses to turn off for some reason. So it's looking strange, but it doesn't look like it's affecting the performance at all. In here, we're really close all the way across the board at 12 watts, 720p, getting about 2 to 3 more FPS on the Ally, but still maintaining over 30 FPS for most of this on the Steam Decks. So if you locked it to 30, this could definitely be a playable experience on the Steam Deck. Bumping it up to 15 watts, and we can just fast forward here a little bit, and we can see about 32, 34 FPS on the OLED, and then 55 on the Ally. This is where the results are just bizarre because we only gave it a little bit more power, and now it's at 55. It's looking like it's almost about to approach 60, then bumping that to 30 watts, and we're at almost 80. So if we just freeze it right here, you can see 36, 37, 58, so about 60, and then over 80 FPS down here at 30 watts. Now at 1080p, 15 watts, we're at about 20 FPS on the Steam Decks. This is where it really suffers, and it's definitely not able to play this game at 1080p, whereas on the Ally, for whatever reason, with a 15 watt TDP, we're sitting at almost 40 FPS. So this is well within the VRR range, and this would be a great experience at 15 watts. And then going up to 30 watts, it's at 52 FPS. That's a massive jump. You can see we're doubling the frame rate here, which it has doubled the power. And here we are in Resident Evil 2. Once again, we do have FSR turned off. I just really don't like it that much. And here's the settings we're using in case you're interested. And you can see we are getting over 60 FPS on the Steam Decks and close to 60 on the Ally. You can see here about 53, so 10 FPS or so less than the OLED. And this is another really surprising game on the Steam Deck. When I loaded it up initially, runs amazingly well. It's surprising how well it runs. And you get great battery life too, which is another huge plus. Then bumping it up to 15 watts, and we're getting pretty good performance, getting a bit higher on the Ally now, maybe about 6, 7 additional FPS. But all of these are extremely high and playable in the 70s to almost 80. And then when we go to 30 watts, we see a pretty big bump. You can look at this, 124 FPS. So it's really able to utilize that extra power. That's crazy amounts. That is out of the actual FreeSync range on the Ally. That's how high that is. Now here at 1080p, and we're about 40 FPS to mid 40s depending. The OLED is doing a bit better, about 2 to 3 more FPS or so than the LCD model. And then about 3 or 4 additional FPS at the same wattage on the Ally at 1080p. Then as we bump that up to 30, we're actually maintaining over 60 for most of this benchmark. So that is definitely a playable experience. And it's not a ton, but 20 additional FPS does make a difference visually, especially when you don't have VRR. You want to try to maintain a locked frame rate on the Steam Decks for the best experience, whereas it can fluctuate quite a bit on the Ally with that VRR. Then moving on to Subnautica, we're just running the high quality preset. And here just swimming along, we'll fast forward the benchmark a little bit. We did get a little stutter on the OLED right here, and it could just be anything with textures and whatnot. But overall, the frame time graph is pretty smooth. And over here, it is struggling on the Ally. And you can see we're at about 43 to 45 FPS between the Steam Decks and only about 37 or so on the Ally, depending on where we're at. Then bumping it up to 15 watts, and the Ally is about 7-8 FPS higher now at that 15 watt range. And when going to 30 watts, we can see here pushing about 70 depending on where we're looking. So about another 20 FPS from 15 watts on the Steam Decks. Then bumping it up to 15 watts, and we can see we're mid 20s on the Steam Decks, and we're getting about 30-ish on the Ally, and then about 40 when we go from 15 to 30 watts on the Ally at 1080p. Next, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and I'm just running the original preset here. It actually seems to run pretty well. And then here, kicking things off, we're at mid 40s on the Steam Decks. I actually run this at a 45 FPS cap, and it has access to 15 watts, which it's able to maintain the 45 most of the time, and it's not a huge deal when it dips. Then on the Ally, we're at about 34, so we're losing roughly 10, 11 FPS at this 12 watt range. Bumping it up to 15 watts, and they're all at about 50 FPS. At 30 watts, we're getting an additional 15 or so FPS on the Ally down here. Then here at 1080p, 15 watts, and we're barely holding 30. This will actually go down and dip below 30s. You can see we're at in the 20s on the LCD and right at 30 on the OLED. Same thing with the Ally, about 32. And then at 30 watts, we are getting about 40. So that is where that difference is made. If you have a power cable and you're playing on the Ally, there is a big difference between being right at 30 and being at 40. The 40 FPS or so is going to be quite a bit better experience. Next, we have Generation Zero. We are just running the medium preset here, and very close across the board, about 35 FPS or so. It's a little bit higher on the Steam Decks at this 12 watt 720p resolution. Then jumping up to 15 watts, we see we're getting about 10 more FPS now, hitting around 45 to 50 FPS instead of the 40 on the Steam Decks, and bumping it up to 30 watts, and we're getting close to 70 FPS. So this is about 30 more FPS going from 15 watts on a Steam Deck to 30 watts on the Ally. Then here at 1080p, it actually slows the game down. So this is not slowed down footage. If I fast forward, you'll see it's actually going slower over here. And I think it's once you get below 30, it actually affects the game itself. And we are down in the low 20s on the Steam Decks, about 30 on the Ally at that 15 watts 1080p. And here you can see 42 or so. So that's a real playable range. And that gets you into the trend we're seeing, which is at 1080p. If you're connecting this to a monitor, you're way better off with the Ally if you're planning on docking it and playing it on a monitor just to get that higher frame rate where it's still going to be playable. Then moving on to the Division, we're just running the medium preset, VSync off. We don't have a frame rate limit. And we are running the actual benchmark for this one. So we'll just fast forward a little bit. And right off the bat, you can see how well the Steam Deck does on this. This was another game where I was surprised. I enjoyed playing this game. And when I loaded it up on the Steam Deck OLED, it seemed to be running pretty well. You can see right here, we're getting, if we rewind before that stuttering, getting about 53, 54. And then about 46 on the Ally, then jumping up to 15 watts. And you can see right here, we're at around mid 70s on the Steam Deck, about 70 on the Ally, and at 30 watts. You can see this GPU is not being utilized all the way. And I don't know if it's some type of CPU bottleneck that's happening or something else weird, but we are only getting about 75 65 FPS or so, 70 FPS. So slightly higher at a 30 watt profile. And you can see here, it is using that wattage. So we're sticking to 29 here, and we're really not getting much benefit at all. This is at 720p though. And at 15 watts, they're all really close. So the LCD, OLED, and Ally are all pretty much the same FPS. Then bumping it up to 1080p, this is where we do start seeing a difference when we go to 30 watts on the Ally, getting about 60, if we just freeze here, about 60 FPS. We're getting about 40 on the Steam Decks, and then about 4 or 5 additional FPS on the Ally at 15 watts. It's definitely still playable on the Steam Decks. You'd want to cap it down to about 35 FPS though. And on to our last game, it's Tom Clancy Wildlands. We're just running this medium preset here, and this game runs pretty well on the Steam Decks as well. And kicking things off, we're in the mid 40s or so on the Steam Decks and about 35 on the Ally. So you can really see where this lower 12 watt limit shines on the Steam Decks. And here at the end, we got about 44 FPS on the LCD, about 45 on the OLED, and then 36 or so on the Ally, bumping it up to 15 watts. And it is pretty much the same across the board. The LCD, the OLED, and the Ally are all very close. The OLED is a little bit better than the LCD, especially in the temperature range. Then you can see on the Ally, we actually are at 57 Celsius. At this lower watts, it runs extremely silent and cool because it's this sipping power. And I believe we are hitting some type of bottleneck. CPU boost is on, so I don't know exactly why the FPS is this low with the GPU being underutilized, but we're sitting at about 5 additional FPS for that 30 watts. And you can see right here, it is using all of that. That's one thing the Ally will just eat whatever you throw at it, even if it's not utilizing all of it. Then going up to 1080p, and we see we're at about 30 FPS or so on the Steam Decks. Really depends on where we're at. If you see we fast forward and go up the mountain, it goes up a little. So let's just freeze right here. We're about mid 30s. Let's go back down here. Let's say mid 30s right here. 41 on the Ally at 15 watts, 1080p. And then about 49.50 going up to 30. So a nice bump in FPS, but not drastic. And who doesn't like benchmarks? So I put charts together for all of the benchmarks we just ran. And first up, we have Crysis. Here on the left, you can see the 12 watt run between all of them. The blue, as you can see down here, is the LCD model. Then in orange, we have the OLED, and red is the Ally. And then we have the 30 watt benchmarks on the Ally below that for 15 watts at 720 and 15 watts at 1080, as you can see right here. And here we can see at 12 watts, 720p, we got a nice little bump going up to the OLED, and we're getting about 83 FPS. And there is quite a drop off here going all the way down to 65 when we're at 12 watts on all the devices. You can see the Ally's struggling a bit. Then as soon as we up it to 15 watts, it's a lot closer. So the LCD and Ally are pretty close, and you can see the OLED is at 91 FPS, which is pretty impressive. Then as soon as we put 30 watts down on the Ally got 107. For 15 watts at 1080p, you can see just stair steps 42, 44 to 47. And then pushing 30 watts, we really didn't see much, which was surprising. It only went up to 54 on the Ally. Moving on to Cyberpunk, we see a really similar result at 12 watts, so around 34, 35. The OLED is getting us just slightly more FPS. With a drop off on the Ally at this lower watt range, it doesn't really like lower watts. Then we can see the LCD, OLED, and Ally are pretty close, with the Ally pulling ahead slightly at that 15 watt range. And then once we push 30 watts to it, it really took off up to about 64 FPS. Then at 15 watts, 1080p, we got those stair steps again. So 24, 26 to 29. And then as soon as we put 30 watts down, the Ally went up to 42. Then here on Doom at 12 watts, 720p, you can see 49, 52, so around 50 FPS on the Steam Decks, with the Ally getting about 20 more FPS. For some reason, the Ally ran this game extremely well, bumping it up to 15 watts, and we're seeing mid 50s on the OLED and about 50 on the LCD, and around 100 FPS at the same 15 watt level on the Ally. Bumping the Ally to 30 watts got us 137 FPS. And then at 15 watts, 1080p, we're getting around 40 on the Steam Decks, about 60 on the Ally, and then bumping it to 30 watts, about 96 FPS. On Dying Light, we're getting about mid 50s on the Steam Decks, and then losing a bit of performance, about 10 FPS on the Ally at 12 watts. Then at 15 watts at 720p, we get these nice stair steps again. So 62 to 66, then to 71 on the Ally. And then putting down 30 watts, we get this nice jump to about 87. And then here at 15 watts, 1080p, just the stair step again. So just slightly bumping performance up as we go along. And then not getting a whole lot for 30 watts. That's 15 extra. I'm only going from 43 to 52 on the Ally. For Forza Horizon 5, really close results. You can see the LCD and the Ally 50-51, and then a little bit better on the OLED at 12 watts, 720p. Bumping it up 3 watts to 15 watts at 720, and we're getting those stair steps again. So quite a big jump even right here, going from 54 to 60 on the Ally. And then if you're comparing it to the LCD model, it's almost 10 FPS, so 9 additional FPS at the same watts. Then putting down 30 watts on the Ally, we're at about 85. So this would be max power. Since the Steam Decks run at 15, that's why these 3 bars right here are your max power. So this is the maximum the Steam Decks can run. This bar is the maximum the Ally can run. And this is only 15 watts, which is only half. Then here at 15 watts, 1080p, you can see the LCD and OLED are pretty close, with the Ally getting about 7 to 8 additional FPS. Then at 30 watts, we're getting 66 FPS. So that is a massive jump, over 20 additional FPS when compared to the maximum watts at 1080p on the LCD and the OLED models of the Steam Deck. For GTA 5 at 12 watts, 720p, we were getting around 60 plus, mid 60s, with the OLED actually approaching 70 FPS. So quite a decent little jump going from the LCD to the OLED. Bumping that up to 15 watts, and you can see we didn't get much change in the LCD. We did get 2 more FPS for the OLED, and then the Ally got another 11 FPS at 76. Then bumping to 30 watts on the Ally, we're at about 90, and this is not as big of a jump as I was expecting. Then at 15 watts, 1080p, we're at 39, 42, and then 51. So we are getting a nice performance bump at 1080p. It seems as the resolution gets higher, that's where the Ally will start outdoing the Steam Decks. But when we're down here in this 720p range, it's not near as much. And then putting down 30 watts, we did get about a 9 FPS bump, or close to 20 FPS when compared to the LCD and OLED models. For Red Dead Redemption 2, we got 34 on the Ally here at 12 watts and about 44 on the LCD and OLED. Bumping it up to 15 watts, and we get slightly better FPS on all of them, and much better on the Ally, going from 34 all the way up to 48. Then at 30 watts, you can see it's going all the way to 61 FPS on the Ally. At 15 watts, 1080p, just small stair steps. And then putting down the extra power, we do get a nice little bump up to almost 40. Here's Insurgency Sandstorm, and this is a game that definitely surprised me in the benchmarks, and even when playing it, I didn't think this game would run that well on the Steam Deck. And it turns out it runs extremely well, gets great battery life, especially at a 45 FPS cap. And you can see here at 12 watts, 70 FPS on both the OLED and the LCD, getting about 56 on the Ally. Going up to 15 watts, and the OLED is starting to approach 80. The LCD is about 75, and the Ally still is not liking the lower power, and we're only getting about 62. And the reason for this is this game, I believe, is pretty CPU intensive. But then when we bump it up to 30, you can see we're getting around 80, but that is extremely impressive that at 15 watts, the Steam Decks are close to the Ally running at 30 in this. Now, as soon as we start switching over to being GPU bound, you can see there's a bit of a difference. So at 15 watts, the LCD, OLED, and Ally are pretty close, with the Ally getting about 4 additional FPS. But then as soon as we bump that to 30, it jumps up to around 67. Then we have Ark Survival Evolved. This is a really hard game for all systems to run, even my laptop to run. And you can see we're getting around 30 FPS on the Steam Decks and about 27 on the Ally. As soon as we bump it to 15 watts though, we are getting about 40 on the Ally, and then getting around 31, 33 on the Steam Decks. Bumping that up to 30 watts, and we jump all the way to 51 FPS, so a very playable frame rate. At 1080p, 15 watts, definitely not playable on any system at 15 watts. So on the Steam Decks, we're at about 19, on the Ally 24. Bumping it up to 30 watts, we are seeing 31 FPS. I would still run this at around 900p or even 720p just to get that extra frame rate, as this is still approaching a level that might not be enjoyable. For Monster Hunter World, we're sitting around a little over the mid 40 range on the Steam Decks, with the Ally coming in at 37. Then upping the power, you can see the Ally from 12 watts to 15 watts. There's a massive jump going up, whereas the Steam Decks are already near their upper power range, going from 12 to 15, which is the max range. We're only getting a slight bump at 48 and 50, but 54 on the Ally. Then at 30 watts, we're at around 70 plus. At 1080p, we're sitting around 30 on all the devices, with the 30 watt mode on the Ally getting us into the 40 FPS range. Then moving on to Metro Exodus, pretty much the same thing. The Ally just really doesn't like the 12 watt, this lower power range here. You can see we're getting over 60 on the Steam Decks and a 49 on the Ally. As soon as we up that to 15, it kind of levels off. So we're getting about 63, 66, 62. So really close, with the OLED beating out both. Pushing 30 watts to the Ally, you can see over here we're getting 80. Then at 15 watts, 1080p, also really close, 43, 44, 46. With that 30 watt giving us a nice bump all the way up into the 60s. Then moving on to BeamNG, basically the same thing here. We can just look at the chart and see that at 30 watts, we really didn't see a whole lot of gain, even on the Ally, so 45 to 51. The Steam Decks are holding pretty strong, even at 12, 15 here, getting over 40 on average. And the OLED is actually getting a nice performance bump in both of these. And even at 1080p, we're still keeping around 30 plus FPS, with the 30 watts on the Ally getting it into the 40s. Then for Resident Evil 4, this is an extremely hard game to run, pretty demanding game. And at 12 watts, the Steam Decks were able to maintain 30 plus FPS. The Ally did not like it, getting around 25. As soon as we upped it to 15 though, then we're getting these playable frame rates, so 36, 37, close to 40. This is a game where putting more power down if you have the Ally is definitely the way to go. You can see at 30 watts, now we're around 51. Then at 15 watts, 1080p, so if you're docking any of these systems, it's really not going to be the best experience no matter what. The Ally at 30 watts is at least maintaining over 30 FPS. But there are scenes in this game that will drop this down frequently below 30 and drop these down into the teens. So this is definitely a game to lower settings and the resolution in to try to get a decently playable and enjoyable experience. It's a bit more difficult on the Steam Deck. Then here we have The Witcher 3 at 12 watts. They're all doing pretty good. The Ally's slightly getting more FPS. At 15 watts, that is where the Ally, for whatever reason, just takes off. Now we're at 55, pushing down 30, 76 FPS. So this is more than doubling the OLED at this point when they're both at their max power range. At 1080p, this is another game where you can actually play this at 1080 with no issues at 15 watts on the Ally, getting around 40, whereas we're in the 20s on the Steam Decks. Then bumping it to 30 watts, we're at about 53. Then we're on to Resident Evil 2. This game runs pretty well at 12 watts, especially on the Steam Decks, and even 53 on the Ally. This is all within a range that you would enjoy playing it. Going up to 15 watts, and we see a nice bump in every system. So 76, 77 on the Steam Decks, 90 on the Ally. And then this game can really just use the power when it's thrown at it. So 30 watts, 124 FPS is what we're seeing on the Ally. At 15 watts, 1080p, this game would still be enjoyable if you're docking the Steam Decks. You can see here 38, 41. And then on the Ally, 46, pushing the power to 30 on the Ally, and we're seeing right at 60. Really similar situation with Subnautica. This is all definitely within a playable frame rate at 12 watts, getting over 40 FPS on the Steam Decks and about 36 on the Ally. As soon as we put a little more power down, you can see we're getting a little bump on the Steam Decks, going from 41 to 43, but a pretty big bump going from 36 to 53 for just those 3 additional watts on the Ally. Then putting down 30, we're at 74 FPS. Then bumping the Ally to 30 watts, it's pulling in around 74 FPS. At 15 watts and 1080p, this is where it does become unplayable in the mid 20s. The Ally you could play at 15 watts, but it's going to be dipping down below 30, which isn't the best experience. So once we put down 30 watts, we're in the 40s, and that definitely is playable. For Horizon Zero Dawn, following the same trend at 12 watts, the Steam Decks are doing really well, getting around 50. The Ally sitting at about 35. At 15 watts, it really levels things off, and you can see we're getting a nice little bump going from the LCD to the OLED with the extra power. And the Ally and OLED are really close, 52, 53. As soon as we bump the Ally to 30 watts, you can see it's getting close to 70 FPS. At 1080p, 15 watts, we're right around 30 on all of these, which would make it just slightly unplayable with it dipping down below the 30s. So this is something where the 30 watt and 40 FPS we're getting on the Ally would be a bit better experience. Generation 0, this is a pretty demanding game as well, which is why I like including it in the benchmarks. And you can see at 12 watts, we're mid 30s on the Steam Decks and just losing a little bit of FPS on the Ally. Bumping it to 15 watts, you can see now we're getting a nice bump, about 5 FPS for the Steam Decks, and the Ally getting close to 20, going from 32 to 50 FPS, with 30 watts giving us 71. Then at 1080p, you can see we're down in the 20s now on all of them, with the Ally close to 30, but still in the 20s at 15 watts. So bumping the Ally to 30 watts does get us right at 40 FPS. Then for the Division, it's actually really close at this 12 watt range. You can see 50, 53, 47. So the OLED is getting a nice little bump as well. As you can see in all of these, it does get slightly better performance than the LCD. Then at 15 watts, you can see we're at 60 FPS. So really nice, really playable on all the systems, with 30 watts only giving us an additional 8 FPS. So probably not worth it on this specific game. Then at 15 watts, 1080p, you can see we're still above 30. So this would be playable at 1080p on the Steam Decks, getting around mid 30s, with the Ally getting in the 40s. And then bumping it to 30 at 1080p, where we have more of a GPU bottleneck, you can see it does take us all the way up to 55 FPS. Then for our last game, we have Ghost Recon Wildlands. You can see we're getting mid 40s on the Steam Decks and around mid 30s on the Ally. Bumping it up to 15 watts, and we are really close across the board now, with the OLED and Ally getting 48, so just a little bit more than the LCD Steam Deck. This game doesn't really care. When bumping the Ally to 30 watts, we get a little bump, but not a whole lot, only going up to 53. Then at 15 watts, 1080p, so up in that resolution, we're really approaching that 30 FPS limit, where we don't really want to be dipping below that. So be more playable on the Ally since it's around 36. And then I'd recommend definitely bumping it up to about 25 or 30 watts. You can see here at 30, we're getting 45 FPS. And that pretty much wraps it up for the charts. And overall, the OLED has slightly better performance than the LCD, but it also runs a lot cooler, has less fan noise, and a lot longer battery life. Then the Ally being close in performance to the OLED at 15 watts is pretty impressive and shows how much Asus has optimized it. I hope y'all enjoyed the benchmarks, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.